October 14, 1944. Rain lashes against the high windows of a small-town public library in the American Midwest. The streets outside are empty, darkened by wartime blackout regulations, but inside, a single lamp casts a pool of yellow light across a wooden table. The silence of the stacks is broken only by the heavy, rhythmic creak of leather boots. A sheriff steps out from the shadows, his hand resting instinctively near his holster. He has been hunting an escapee for 3 days, a fugitive from the nearby prisoner of war camp. He expects to find a desperate enemy soldier cornered like a rat. Instead, he finds a young woman. She is not running. She is not armed. She is sitting perfectly still, her dirty camp uniform stark against the mahogany furniture, reading a history of the American Revolution. When she looks up, there is no fear in her eyes, only a quiet, burning curiosity. She tells him she simply wanted to understand how a country could be so free. The sheriff, his hand falling from his weapon, does not cuff her. Instead, he reaches into his pocket to pay for the book. This intimate exchange in a quiet library stands in stark contrast to the thunderous collapse that brought hundreds of thousands of Germans to American soil. The journey began 18 months earlier, in the burning sands of Tunisia, May 1943. The Afrika Korps, once the jagged spear tip of the Third Reich, had been shattered. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim surrendered nearly 250,000 Axis troops to the Allies. It was a logistical nightmare of unprecedented scale. The British, already straining under food shortages and a crowded island infrastructure, could not absorb this sudden influx of humanity. The solution lay across the Atlantic. The United States had the space, the food, and the desperate need for labour, but it had never hosted a foreign army within its borders. The mechanism of transport was the Liberty ship. These mass-produced vessels, which had carried tanks and grain to the European theatre, were returning empty. Now they were filled with the enemy. For the German soldiers, terrified by Goebbels' propaganda, the voyage was expected to be a death sentence. They had been told that New York was a smoking ruin bombed by the Luftwaffe, and that Americans were a primitive, vengeful mob who would starve or execute them upon arrival. Instead, the reality of the crossing began the slow erosion of their worldview. They were not beaten or starved. They were fed. The rations on the transport ships often exceeded what the average Wehrmacht soldier had eaten in months on the front lines. White bread, coffee, meat and cigarettes were distributed with a casual abundance that was incomprehensible to men who had been scraping by on ersatz rations. As the convoys cut through the grey Atlantic, a psychological shift began. The supermen of the Reich were being transported not to a dungeon, but to a land of surplus. This cognitive dissonance would only deepen when the ships docked in Norfolk, Virginia, and Boston, Massachusetts. The disembarkation was a sensory assault. German prisoners stepped off the ships onto American docks that were bustling not with chaos, but with terrifying efficiency. There were no smoking ruins in New York or Boston. The skylines were intact, the lights were blazing, and the traffic was deafening. But the true revelation occurred during the transit inland. The US Army loaded the prisoners onto Pullman passenger trains for the long journey to the permanent camps scattered across the South and Midwest. For days, the prisoners sat by the windows, watching the American continent roll by. They saw endless fields of corn in Nebraska, vast herds of cattle in Texas, and thousands of miles of unbombed industrial infrastructure. They passed train after train, loaded with brand new Sherman tanks, jeeps, and aircraft fuselages heading east. It was a display of logistical power that rendered the Nazi propaganda machine obsolete in an instant. One German corporal wrote in his diary that seeing the sheer size of the American rail network made him realize, for the first time, that the war was mathematically unwinnable. The destination for these men was a network of over 700 camps, often located in rural isolation, places like Camp Aliceville in Alabama, Camp Hearn in Texas, or Camp Alva in Oklahoma. These facilities were constructed with standard Army blueprints: barracks, mess halls, infirmaries, and barbed wire. This was the Golden Cage. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required that prisoners of war be housed and fed at the same standard as the capturing nation's own rear echelon troops. For the Germans, this meant heated barracks, hot showers, and 3,000 calories a day. They had soccer leagues, orchestras, and theatre troupes. But beneath this surface of comfort, a dangerous political war was brewing. The camps were not just holding pens, they were pressure cookers, where the most fanatical elements of the Nazi regime were locked in with the weary, the disillusioned, and the curious. While the American guards patrolled the perimeter wire, a far more brutal war was being fought inside the barracks. The US military, in its initial naivety, had made a critical error. They segregated prisoners by rank, but not by ideology. This meant that battle-hardened SS officers and fanatical members of the Afrika Korps were housed in the same bunk rooms as draftees, anti-Nazis, and teenagers who had surrendered at the first opportunity. The result was a reign of terror enforced by the Lager Gestapo, informal groups of die-hard loyalists who took control of the internal life of the camps. They established a shadow government under the noses of the American Camp Command. Their goal was to maintain discipline, prevent defections, and ensure that the National Socialist spirit survived even in captivity. They monitored the mail. They listened to private conversations. If a prisoner was heard speaking too fondly of the Americans, or if he expressed doubt about the Führer's final victory, he would receive a Holy Ghost visit in the middle of the night. A towel would be wrapped around his head to muffle the screams, and he would be beaten with bars of soap wrapped in socks, a method that left severe internal injuries, but no obvious marks for the American doctors to document. But the violence escalated beyond beatings. In Camp Concordia, Kansas, and Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, traitors were subjected to kangaroo courts. These secret tribunals were held in the latrines or behind the mess halls after lights out. The accused were not allowed a defense. The verdict was often death. There are documented cases of prisoners being forced to commit suicide to protect their families back in Germany from Gestapo retaliation. Others were found hanging in the morning, their deaths ruled as suicides by oblivious American coroners, when in reality they had been lynched by their own comrades for the crime of reading an American newspaper. The camps were safe from the war outside, but they were deadly for those who dared to think freely. Beyond the barbed wire and the shadow of the internal Gestapo, a different dynamic was emerging under the open sky. By 1944, with millions of American men fighting overseas, the US agricultural sector faced a catastrophic labour shortage. The solution was the prisoners. Under the Geneva Convention, enlisted men could be required to work, provided the labour was not directly related to the war effort and wasn't dangerous. Soon, thousands of German soldiers were trucking out to local farms every morning. They picked cotton in Mississippi, harvested corn in Nebraska, and canned tomatoes in Indiana. This contact with the American landscape and its people was transformative. The farmers often ignored the rules against fraternization. They invited the prisoners to sit at their dinner tables. They shared lemonade on hot afternoons. For many Germans, who had been taught that Americans were soulless capitalists, seeing the hard work and decency of a rural family shattered the caricature. They realized the enemy was just a farmer, worried about the rain, exactly like their own fathers back in Bavaria. Parallel to this physical labor was a more subtle psychological operation, the Intellectual Diversion program. Spearheaded by the Special Projects Division of the Provost Marshal General's Office, this was a secret initiative designed to denazify the prisoners not through force, but through access. The program quietly flooded the camps with materials that had been banned in Germany for a decade. They didn't lecture the prisoners, they simply stocked the camp libraries. Books by Thomas Mann and Erich Maria Remarque appeared on the shelves. Copies of the New York Times and Der Hof were left in the canteens. It was a strategy of counter-propaganda through facts. The prisoners could read uncensored accounts of the war's progress. They could read American history books that debated the flaws of democracy openly, a concept alien to the totalitarian mindset. It was in these quiet moments, turning the pages of a book in a camp library, that the intellectual armor of the Third Reich began to rust. The woman found in the sheriff's library was not an anomaly. She was the ultimate success of a program designed to make the enemy ask questions. Spring 1945. The tension inside the camps tightened until it was physically painful. The weather across the American South was turning warm and verdant, but the news from across the Atlantic was a drumbeat of catastrophe. The intellectual diversion had laid the groundwork, but reality was delivering the final blow. In the mess halls of Camp Gruber and Camp Ruston, thousands of men gathered around the radios in total silence. They traced the front lines on illicit maps hidden under bunk mattresses. The geography of their defeat was undeniable. The Americans were across the Rhine. The Russians were in the suburbs of Berlin. The Lager Gestapo tried to maintain control, spreading rumours of miracle weapons, the V-2 rockets or jet fighters that would turn the tide at the last second. They insisted that the retreat was a strategic lure, but the mail from home had stopped. The letters that did arrive spoke of cities turned to ash, of starvation, of total ruin. Then came April 12, 1945. President Franklin D. Roosevelt died. For a brief flickering moment, a cheer went up among the hardliners. They believed this was the miracle, the House of Cards moment that would cause the Allied coalition to collapse. They celebrated in the barracks, convinced that destiny had saved the Reich again. That hope lasted exactly 18 days. On May 1, the radio announcers interrupted the music with a grave voice. Adolf Hitler was dead. He had not died leading a charge, but by his own hand in a bunker beneath the rubble of Berlin. The effect on the prisoners was cataclysmic. For 12 years they had been indoctrinated to believe that Hitler was Germany, and Germany was Hitler. Without him, their universe had no center. In Camp Robinson, Arkansas, witnesses reported a silence so profound it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Grown men, veterans of the Eastern Front, put their heads on the tables and wept, not for Hitler, but for the sudden, crushing realization that their sacrifice had been for a ghost. The supermen were alone. The spell was broken. If the death of Hitler broke their spirit, what came next broke their denial. In the weeks following VE Day, the US Army implemented a mandatory viewing policy. Every German prisoner of war was ordered to march into the camp theatre or sit in the recreation hall. The lights were dimmed, the projector whirred to life. But this was not a Hollywood movie. It was raw footage filmed by the Signal Corps units that had liberated the concentration camps at Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen. The screen flickered with images of bulldozers pushing emaciated bodies into mass graves. It showed the piles of shoes, the ovens, the walking skeletons staring hollowly into the camera. The atrocity films were not propaganda. They were evidence. Inside the darkened halls of camps across Texas, Oklahoma, and Alabama, the reaction was visceral. Some men vomited. Some fainted. Others screamed at the screen, shouting, "Lügen! Lies!" in in a desperate attempt to reject what they were seeing. But for the vast majority, the silence was absolute and terrifying. These were soldiers who had convinced themselves they were fighting a noble war for their homeland, defending European culture against Bolshevism. Now, they were forced to look at the industrial slaughter committed in their name. In Camp Butner, North Carolina, a group of prisoners emerged from the theatre and immediately burned their Wehrmacht uniforms in a pile in the yard. In another camp, a riot nearly broke out, not against the guards, but against the Nazi officers who had led them. The Lager Gestapo lost their power in the span of a 20-minute newsreel. The arrogance was gone. The ideological war was over. The German mind had been cracked open, leaving behind only shame and a desperate, burning question. How could we have let this happen? The war was over, but the punishment was just beginning. For the 371,000 German prisoners in America, the surrender of Germany did not mean immediate freedom. In fact, their status changed overnight. They were no longer prisoners of war, protected by the Geneva Convention's strictest rules. They were now disarmed enemy forces. The abundant rations were cut, the friendly interactions with farmers were curtailed, and most crushing of all, the ships that were supposed to take them home didn't come. Europe was a ruin. France and Britain, their economies shattered and their workforces depleted, demanded reparations in the form of labour. So, instead of returning to their families in Hamburg or Munich, thousands of German POWs were shipped from the comfort of the US camps to the harsh realities of post-war France and the United Kingdom to clear minefields and rebuild roads. The journey back across the Atlantic was a dark mirror of their arrival. They were packed into the holds of cargo ships, conditions far worse than the Liberty ships of 1943. They called them hell ships. On arrival in Europe, they saw the consequences of the war firsthand. The flattened cities, the starving children, the total absence of the infrastructure they had marveled at in America. Yet, amidst this hardship, the seeds planted in the American camps began to sprout. The men who had spent 2 years reading the New York Times, debating democracy in the barracks, and working alongside American farmers carried something back with them that was more valuable than the cigarettes or chocolate they had hoarded. They carried a new perspective. Reports from the Allied occupation authorities noted a distinct difference between prisoners returning from the US and those returning from the Russian front. The American Germans were healthier, yes, but they were also more vocal, more questioning, and surprisingly, more optimistic. They had seen a working democracy. They had lived in a society where a sheriff could buy a prisoner a book instead of shooting her. The true return on the American investment did not appear on a balance sheet, but in the ballot boxes of the newly formed Federal Republic of Germany. As the 1940s gave way to the 1950s, West Germany began its Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle that rose from the ash. But supporting this economic scaffolding was a political miracle. The men who had returned from the camps in Texas and Oklahoma were disproportionately represented in the new civil society. They became the mayors of small towns, the editors of local newspapers, the teachers in rebuilt schools, and the mid-level functionaries of the new democratic government. The Intellectual Diversion program had created a cadre of men who understood that authority did not require tyranny. When the West German Army, the Bundeswehr, was founded in 1955, its guiding principle was innere Führung, inner leadership, a concept that emphasized the citizen in uniform, bound by conscience rather than blind obedience. This was a direct rejection of the Wehrmacht ethos, and it was championed by officers who had spent their captivity studying the US Constitution. The United States had spent millions of dollars feeding and educating these men. At the time, critics in Congress had called it a waste of resources on Nazi murderers. But history would vindicate the expense. The POWs became the human bridge between two former enemies. They were the inoculation that prevented the virus of fascism from mutating and returning. The Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, dividing East and West. In the East, the Soviets imposed loyalty through the Stasi and the tank. In the West, loyalty had been earned years earlier, in the cotton fields of the American South and the quiet corners of camp libraries. The secret war for the German mind had been won, not by breaking the enemy, but by rebuilding him. We return, finally, to that small, rain-swept library in the American Midwest. The sheriff, whose name history has not recorded, did not know that his simple act of purchasing a book was a microcosm of a much larger victory. He did not treat the escapee as a monster, nor as a target. He treated her as a human being capable of change. In doing so, he dismantled the lies of the Third Reich more effectively than any artillery barrage ever could. The story of the German POWs in America is a testament to a forgotten front of the Second World War. It challenges the cynical view that war is only about destruction. While the battles in Europe pulverized cities, the camps in America quietly pulverized an ideology. The United States took in an army of enemies and sent back an army of ambassadors. It proved that while totalitarianism relies on the suppression of information, freedom relies on its dissemination. The Nazi regime feared that if their soldiers saw the world as it truly was, they would stop fighting. And they were right. The legacy of the Golden Cage is not found in the crumbling foundations of the old barracks in Texas or Alabama, which have long since been reclaimed by the grass. It is found in the stability of modern Europe. It serves as a powerful reminder that the most dangerous weapon in a war against tyranny is not a bomb, but a question. And the ultimate victory is not when the enemy dies, but when the enemy opens a book, reads the truth, and decides to become a friend.